Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching How Did the Sinking of the Moskva Impact the War in Ukraine by Kings and Generals. This is basically part 1.5 of our series on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Part 2 is on the Battle of the Donbass, and that's what we will be reacting to next time. But I thought it would be interesting to do one sort of in between part 1 and part 2. I remember the sinking of the Moskva when it happened. It was sort of during the early phase of the war. It was a pretty important, monumental event, and I'm excited to learn a little bit more about the ship and the impact its sinking had on the war as a whole. Anyway, if you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd very much appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon or check out becoming a channel member for exclusive reaction content. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
On the 13th of April 2022, the Ukrainian government reported that their armed forces hit the Moskva cruiser, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet.
And I remember seeing stuff all about this over Twitter. That was the first place I saw it, tweets about it, videos, photos, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, look, I have a lot of critiques about Twitter, and I don't think getting your information from social media is a reliable way to get your information. But one thing you can say about sort of our modern era of social media is that information has very much been decentralized, and a lot of this information, which then ends up in the newspapers, comes from regular people on the ground reporting this stuff, uploading pictures and what they've seen to the internet. And we are the first people to view that. Now, once again, most of the stuff you're going to see on social media about news or current events is generally not reliable, so take everything with a grain of salt. But some of the stuff you see, that's what's going to make it onto the New York Times, CNN, BBC, whatever. And they're going to be a little slower to pick it up because they have to vet it. So it's just sort of an interesting note about the spread of information and disinformation during this conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Later, Russia refuted that Moskva was hit, but acknowledged that it was damaged due to an explosion of ammunition caused by a fire on the warship. It sank on April 14th.
Yeah, well, throughout this, whole war, although Russia doesn't want to refer to it as a war, Russia has been pumping out its own information. The Russian government has been pumping out its own disinformation and misinformation, primarily to make it look like, one, the war isn't going as bad as it actually is going for them, and two, trying to sort of retroactively reorient their goals. After Russia's all-out attack on the entirety of Ukraine, including the capital, failed, and Russia had to scale back to mostly sort of eastern and southern Ukraine, the Russian government said, well, actually, our initial goal was just to conquer the east anyway. Now, that is clearly untrue, but that's them sort of trying to shape the narrative, and we can see an example of that with the Moskva.
In this video, we're going to talk about the history of the Moskva cruiser, its role in Russian military.
Now, this is what I'm excited to hear about: the history of the ship, when it was built, what it's done before this, sort of its role in the war. This is the stuff that I don't really know anything about. I just saw the headlines and read the articles when this popped up.
Military operations in the 21st century, including the invasion of Ukraine, and the impact its sinking is going to have on the war. If you're into modern naval warfare, then we've got a useful offer for you from our sponsor, World of...
Alright, and here's the sponsorship. Same as usual, please go and check out Kings and Generals' video. It's linked in the description below. Give them a like, subscribe to their channel, and please check out their sponsor. Show them support for making these fantastic videos.
The Moskva cruiser was built in the 1970s in the Mykolaiv shipyard in the Ukrainian SSR and was commissioned in 1983 under the name Slava.
Interesting, an old Soviet warship. A lot of Russia's arms, their artillery, their guns, their bombs, their ships, a lot of them do come from the Soviet era. We think of the Cold War, there was a massive buildup of arms and weaponry during that period, And there has been a decline after the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, though, of course, things have been heating up again recently. And so a lot of the weapons that Russia uses now are from the Soviet Union a couple decades ago.
Glory in Russian. The Slava was a 186-meter-long, 12,490-ton cruiser, which had a capacity to accommodate more than 500 crew members. It carried surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missiles, deck guns, torpedoes, mortars, and possessed a helicopter deck. In the Cold War period, the Slava cruiser also carried nuclear weapons. The most notable appearance of the Slava in the Cold War-era news is related to the use of the cruiser in the Malta meeting between Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush in Malta in 1989, which housed the Soviet delegation.
1989, we're talking coming very close to the end and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, a little interesting factoid, of course, Gorbachev wanted to reform the USSR while still keeping it alive. It was not his intention to completely destroy the Soviet Union. That sort of happened by accident. Sounds a little silly to say, how can such a massive powerhouse collapse by accident? That is really how it happened. And George H.W. Bush, of course, the Americans opposed the Soviet Union, and they had for a long time. At this point, relations were getting a lot better than they had been in the past. But George H.W. Bush and some American analysts were actually pretty wary about the USSR collapsing and these political reforms. In fact, they urged caution because they were worried about the consequences of the Soviet Union collapsing. They were worried about the power vacuum that it would create and a lot of the problems it would cause. And, when the USSR did collapse, it did cause a lot of problems. So a lot of American analysts, not all, definitely not all, but some, were not as enthusiastic about the USSR crumbling as you might have thought, or as they would have been, say, 20 years ago.
Delegation, and was supposed to host the meeting between the leaders, but a gale forced the sides to meet on board of the Maxim Gorky cruiser instead. In the same year, American and Soviet scientists conducted joint tests aboard the Slava cruiser to measure the emissions of neutrons and gamma rays from a nuclear warhead on this warship. In 1990, the Slava was placed in the Mykolaiv shipyard for...
Look at that. American and Soviet scientists working together. If the USSR hadn't completely collapsed, it's pretty reasonable to think that relations between the USSR and the US, would have calmed down to an even more normal level, and we would have seen a lot more collaboration between the two superpowers. Of course, that's not how it went.
For repairs, and was kept there until 1999. While being repaired, it was renamed the Moskva. After being recommissioned, it became the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in 2000. Russian President Vladimir Putin has used the Moskva cruiser on several occasions to host talks with other world leaders. In 2003, Putin and the then Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi travelled together aboard the Moskva cruiser to Sardinia, where Putin reportedly said, "Thank God our cruisers can still go on their own. Our planes and missiles can fly."
Interesting. So it seems like the Moskva actually served a lot of diplomatic and political roles. It had a certain level of political significance. We're seeing its role in a lot of different meetings of international politics, collaboration with different countries. So far, actually not a lot of military action, more symbolism on the political side of things.
During this trip, Putin also visited the La Maddalena naval base, operated by the United States. He interpreted his visit to this place and the presence of the Moskva cruiser as an indicator that the level of trust between Russia and the NATO countries is rising.
Yeah, and that might sound shocking today, but if we think back to history, though history that's only about 20 years old, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union, then the 1990s, a period of chaos and pain for Russia and many of the former Soviet countries. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of disastrous economic policy. I could really go into this for a long time, but basically it was a disaster. The economy suffered, standards of living dropped, So Russia wasn't really ready to do anything in the 1990s, and the Western countries weren't really quick to reach out a hand and help them up. But by the end of the 90s, into the 2000s, Russia's economy had begun to improve, standards of living had slowly begun to rise again, and so by the early 2000s, Russia was sort of on a better path. And of course, in the early 2000s, Putin took over from Yeltsin, and Putin was very popular. I mean, he's always been an authoritarian strongman, but with the economy rising and the standard of living rising, he was popular with the Russian people. And at that point in the early 2000s, I mean, look, the signs were there that he was an authoritarian strongman from the beginning, but he didn't look nearly as bad as he would become. And so, as Russia began to improve, their relations with countries around the world also began to improve. And Russia had much better relations with America, the other Western countries, countries around the globe. It was definitely more a period of optimism for Russia. Now, of course, things have gone very badly since then. Part of it is Putin's authoritarianism. Russia's suffered some economic struggles. They've had this expansionist foreign policy that's gotten them in trouble, gotten a lot of sanctions placed on them. But back in the early 2000s, though, like I said, there were signs of authoritarianism. I mean, just ask the Chechens. They were abused by the Russian government. Things did seem to be looking up, and that was true on an international level as well.
But with the worsening relations between Russia and NATO, the role of the Moskva cruiser changed too.
Yeah.
In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, and the Moskva fought the Georgian Navy.
And I mean, this was one of the first major actions of Russian aggression. I mean, we have the wars against Chechnya, in the 90s and early 2000s, I think. Those were horrific and brutal, though I think they're kind of generally more seen as like an internal Russian matter, whether you think that's fair or not. And there were signs of Russian aggression before 2008, but this was the first major event, the Russian invasion of Georgia. And this is when, globally, all the other countries started going, oh no, something's going seriously wrong with the Putin government. This is not how it should be. And of course, this was sort of the beginning of Russia becoming really aggressive on the international stage. Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, and then, the entire invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
After Russia recognized the independence of the separatist Republic of Abkhazia, the warship was stationed in its capital.
Noticing some similarities, by the way, this is what Russia does. They claim some grievance. The Georgian government abused ethnic Russians or some ethnic minority. They claim the same thing with Ukraine. They invade, and then they take regions like Donbass, or in this case, Abkhazia, and they say, this is an independent region under a Russian protectorate, which means, of course, they station troops there, and they can sort of de facto control the region. And the local government, in this case the Georgian government, has now basically lost that territory. Russia does this repeatedly.
Capital, Sukhumi. It took part in the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, as it blocked the Ukrainian...
And by the way, it is interesting how we can see, as Russia's gone from more a period of rapprochement and sort of good international relations with the world to an era of international aggression, the Moskva has gone from a ship that was mostly used for diplomatic and political purposes to a ship that is now being used for expressly military purposes.
In warships from leaving Lake Donoslav. During the war in Syria, the Moskva cruiser was stationed in the eastern Mediterranean, near the Syrian-Turkish border, to provide air defense for the Russian aircraft carrying out missions in Syria. In 2018, it was once again sent for repairs, which were completed in 2020. As the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva cruiser was involved in the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as well. According to various reports, at this time the Moskva was armed with 16 P-1000 Vulcan anti-ship cruise missiles, with a range capability of at least 700 kilometers, and...
Now, of course, this has primarily been a land war, but control of the Black Sea is very important, and I mean, Russia knows this. Why do you think they took Crimea in 2014? It's still really important to have that naval power in the region, gives you a lot of power generally over the entire conflict.
And S-300 anti-air missiles. Along with that, it was equipped with 6 close-in weapon systems to protect the warship. It had a capability of 360-degree anti-air defense. The former chief of the Russian Navy's General Staff, Viktor Kravchenko, called the Moskva cruiser the most serious ship in the Black Sea.
Yeah.
It is confirmed that it was the Moskva which was tasked with ensuring the capture of Zminy Island in the early days of the Russian invasion. And yes, it was the Moskva which demanded the surrender of the small contingent of Ukrainian troops stationed in Zminy, and received an iconic response of off Russian military ship, becoming the first major symbol of Ukrainian defiance in this.
Yeah, I remember that. You always gotta love, we have a lot of these instances of, bigger, more intimidating powers demanding a surrender from a small garrison or troops that are surrounded, and then we get iconic responses like that. Of course, another one we saw last time was Zelensky early in the war. I forget exactly what his line was, but it was something like, when the Western powers had offered him a way out of Ukraine, he said something along the lines of, I don't need a ride, I need guns, or I need ammunition. That was another iconic line early in the war.
War. It is the only confirmed participation of the Moskva cruiser in this war, apart from its sinking. But some military experts have talked about the presumed missions of this warship. One of the reports claims that the Moskva...
Okay, and what I will say before we get into this is, remember, this video is from months ago. So we have a lot more information now than we did at this point. I'm not an expert on the topic, so I can't necessarily tell you what more information we have, but some of the stuff we're hearing here as we get into current events and the Moskva's role in the war, it might be outdated, or more likely, we'll probably know more information or more detail than we did when Kings and Generals made this video. Still a good video to watch, but just remember, when we're dealing with these sort of current events, information can change or be updated pretty quickly.
Moskva played an important role in ensuring the Russian air advantage over Crimea and the Kherson Oblast, which had been occupied in the early days of the invasion. But since Russia already possesses powerful air defense systems in Crimea, the above claim about the role of the Moskva cruiser in the air defense of Crimea and Kherson is possible to dispute. There have also been claims about the role the Moskva cruiser played in the siege of Mariupol, which is disputed.
As we saw last time, that was a very important siege and important moment in the war. Mariupol was a very key point of conflict.
Disputed by the Institute for the Study of War, which stated that this warship was unlikely to have supported Russian strikes on Ukrainian land targets and primarily provided air defense coverage to Russia's Black Sea Fleet.
Okay.
Some military analysts have also argued that the Moskva cruiser was going to have a role in the amphibious landing of Russian troops to the strategically important Black Sea port of Odessa. The reports of the Ukrainian and Russian militaries regarding the sinking of the Moskva cruiser conflict too.
Of course.
Ukraine claimed that the warship was hit by 2 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles of Ukrainian production on the 13th of April, around 100 kilometers off the coast of Odessa. The Ukrainian command reported the capsizing and later sinking of the ship on the following day. The Russian command acknowledged the damage to the Moskva cruiser, but did not mention the Ukrainian missile strikes. It claimed that the warship was on fire due to an explosion of ammunition on it.
Now, look, we don't know what exactly happened. You gotta remember, though I think a lot of us side with Ukraine on this, right? Both sides are putting out information about their role in the war, and both sides are putting out propaganda. Now, I would think that Ukraine is definitely putting out more true information than Russia is. Russia needs the disinformation more because the war isn't going their way. But, these are two countries at war. They both want to make themselves look good to the international community. I mean, Russia is struggling to do that, but so both sides are putting out propaganda, and we have conflicting information here. I would, definitely believe Ukraine's side of the story more, but, it could be what Russia is saying is true. It kind of reminds me of the sinking of the Maine in, the American-Spanish War over Cuba, the Spanish-American War, where, except it was used for a totally different purpose. I mean, remember the Maine? That was sort of used to begin the war. The Americans said, the Spanish had sunk the ship, whereas the Spanish said it was an accident. Of course, we kind of have a flipped situation here where Ukraine is saying, we sunk the ship, and Russia's saying, no, you didn't, it was an accident. So, these are not really comparable events, but sort of the disagreement over what happened sort of reminded me of the Maine.
They put out the fire, which damaged the ship, but did not sink it. But in the evening of the 14th of April, Russia finally acknowledged the sinking of the Moskva cruiser, which was allegedly caused due to the loss of its stability when it was towed to the port because of the damage to the ship's hull that it received during the fire from the detonation of ammunition.
Whether you believe it was a fire or the Ukrainians took down the ship, I think the Ukrainians took down the ship. What both sides were forced to acknowledge, what Russia was forced to acknowledge, was that the ship was sunk. That was undisputable after a certain point.
In stormy sea conditions, the ship sank. The fate of the crew is unknown, but a large number of casualties is highly likely. The photos released anonymously on the 17th of April show extensive damage and fires on the ship. Some naval analysts claim that the two impact craters from the Neptune missiles are clearly visible in the photos.
I will say, as I mentioned in the last video, though, I think Ukraine's cause is just and Russia's isn't. It's never good to see people die in this conflict, whether they're Ukrainian or Russian soldiers. Many Russian soldiers are conscripts who didn't want to be there. So any loss of life is truly tragic, and I hope that as many Russian soldiers were able to escape off the ship as was possible. Just to be clear, this is a serious ongoing conflict, and though, like I said, I think there are sides to take, and more important than taking sides, I think just a fair analysis of the situation, you can say that Ukraine was unfairly invaded by Russia, and so Ukraine has a right to defend itself, and Russia has absolutely no right to even be in their country. While all of that is true, any loss of life is really tragic. It's really unfortunate. So that should be mourned sort of regardless of the circumstances.
We can also see the discoloration around the portholes of the vessel, which might imply that the damage done by the missile explosion caused fires both on the deck and below it. The fact that the rescue rafts that were seen in photos of the Moskva published on the 10th of April in the vicinity of Sevastopol are missing in the April 17th photos might mean that a considerable number of crew members might have escaped.
That's good.
On the 16th, the Russian Ministry of Defense published a video that allegedly shows the crew of the Moskva meeting the commander of the Russian fleet in Sevastopol. Experts claim that only around 200 sailors participated in this event. Now, what is the impact of the sinking of the Moskva cruiser on the Russian offensive against Ukraine?
Now this is something else I'm curious about. Once again, we might have updated information on this because it's months later, but to give my analysis before we get into it, it seems like the Moskva definitely was important to the Russian naval effort in the Black Sea, though I feel like the sinking was maybe more of a symbolic victory than a strategic victory, though it certainly was a strategic victory for Ukraine, but I don't know what I'm talking about. We're about to hear, some more accurate analysis.
In a military sense, not much.
Okay,
According
there you
to a
go.
US official, Russia had employed warships in the war against Ukraine in a limited manner to carry out occasional strikes and resupply troops in the...
Okay, there you go. So maybe it wasn't actually that important in a military sense, but I think symbolically it was a big deal.
south. While Russia has two other missile cruisers of the same class, Marshal Ustinov and the Vayag, they are deployed in the eastern Mediterranean, and Turkey has closed the straits in accordance with the 1936 Montreux Convention, which would prevent Russia from bringing exact substitution for their loss.
Yeah.
The biggest operational difference caused by the sinking of the Moskva is the Russian Black Sea Fleet moving further offshore to a distance of about 80 nautical miles. This would put these ships out of the reach of Ukrainian land missiles. Moskva was crucial for the amphibious assault operations, as it was supposed to cover the smaller, more vulnerable landing ships, so this loss might make the possibly planned amphibious landings unlikely.
Right, so I guess the question would be, to what extent did Russia actually plan these amphibious operations? Seems like there's disagreement over to what extent Russia actually wanted to perform these operations. So if you think that Russia was, getting ready to do all these amphibious operations, then the loss of the Moskva would be a big deal. But if you think that's not the case, and it seems more likely that it's probably not the case, then the loss of the Moskva is, in a strategic sense, not as big a deal.
There is an ongoing discussion on the number of Neptune missiles that Ukraine was able to produce before the invasion started. But the possibility that there are more of them might mean that the Russians won't approach the coastal areas under Ukrainian control. The biggest damage inflicted on Russia by the sinking of the Moskva cruiser is more reputational.
Yeah.
Even though the incident is not going to alter the course of the war in Ukraine, it is a huge propaganda win for Ukraine.
Oh yeah.
They were able to sink the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet with a Ukrainian missile.
I mean, like I said, I remember when this happened, seeing it all over social media, and then seeing it in the news. This was a sort of massive time of celebration for Ukrainians and those supporting Ukraine in the war. It was a big achievement, a big symbolic win for Ukraine, a big symbolic loss for Russia. So yeah, I mean, they're exactly right, and a lot of us saw that sort of propaganda play out in real time. Look, sometimes propaganda is something deliberately peddled by a particular government. Sometimes propaganda just sort of presents itself at your feet. And this was one of those instances where this was a big propaganda win for the Ukrainians, and they didn't really have to twist it in any particular direction. They could just present what actually happened. I mean, that depends on whether you believe it was the Ukrainians who sunk the ship or, the ship just caught on fire. But regardless, the ship sunk. Or sank.
This ship had an apparent symbolic meaning for Putin, as he had used it on several occasions as the venue of meetings with foreign leaders. It also demonstrates that while on paper the Russian military is mighty, in real life it makes head-scratching mistakes in terms of adhering to necessary protocols to ensure the protection of its military assets. After all, the Moskva had everything to withstand the missile attack on it, but failed to do so. We are going to talk more about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the coming weeks, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps.
Alright, and make sure to do the same on this video. Like I said, this is sort of episode 1.5 of our series on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We did how Ukraine won the first phase of the war last time, and after this we will be doing the Battle of Donbass. These are, they're longer 30-minute episodes summing up everything that happened in a particular period of time. This was a more specific video, but I thought it was still important to cover. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more content on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and more content of all different types. We've got many different types of reaction videos on this channel. Please check them out. Please leave a like on this video, leave a comment, subscribe, check out the Patreon and channel memberships. All of that out of the way. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.